A black iron pot hangs above a fire. Nothing unusual about it. No gold. No secret symbol. No warning. Just food. 17 people are going to eat from that pot tonight. 17. Remember that number. Because before the sun rises again, 2 of them will be dead. Not wounded. Not recovering. Dead. And the one man the poison was probably meant for never even touches the food. That should have ended the story. It didn't. Because the real horror begins after the deaths. The king hears what happened. And instead of searching for the person behind it, he does something else. Something colder. Something far more dangerous. He calls Parliament. And within weeks, the laws of England are rewritten around a single terrified idea. Not rebellion. Not war. Not treason. Food. A kingdom became afraid of kitchens. Servants became afraid of cooking. And one ordinary pot of food changed the law forever. The fire had already been burning for hours. Low at first. Then hotter. Then steady. An iron pot sat above it, blackened from years of smoke and heat. The sides were scarred. The handle bent slightly downward from age. Steam climbed slowly from the surface in thin white lines that disappeared into the cold February air. Ordinary. That is the important part. Nothing about the kitchen looked strange that morning. No shouting. No panic. No guards at the door. Just servants moving in practiced rhythm through a room they knew too well to think about anymore. A knife against wood. Water spilling into buckets. The dull sound of iron scraping iron. Routine. And routine is dangerous because people stop looking closely at it. 17 people would eat from that pot before the day was over. Inside the household, servants prepared bowls and bread without hurry. Outside the gates, the poor had already started gathering. That was normal too. Bishop Fisher's home was known for feeding hungry people. Not as a show. Not for praise. Simply because the bishop believed food should not stop at walls. Some came every day. Others only when they had nowhere else left to go. One woman arrived shortly before noon. Thin. Cold. Wrapped in layers that looked more like rags than clothing. Nobody asked her name. Nobody expected they would need to remember it. That matters later. Inside the kitchen stood a man named Richard Roose. The cook. Not new. Not suspicious. Not nervous. That is what makes stories like this frightening. People expect evil to look unusual. They expect warning signs. Strange faces. Strange behavior. But most disasters begin inside ordinary rooms beside ordinary people doing ordinary work. Roose moved around the pot the same way he always did. Calmly. Confidently. Like a man who belonged there. Because he did. Nobody watched him closely. Why would they? A kitchen cannot function if every servant is treated like a criminal. Trust is part of the machinery. Without it, the entire household collapses into fear. At some point during preparation, something entered the pot. Quietly. No witness stepped forward later saying they saw it happen. No servant described a dramatic moment. No dropped bottle. No strange smell filling the room. Just one small action hidden inside hundreds of ordinary movements. A hand. A powder. A moment. And then the meal continued cooking. The first people ate shortly after midday. At first, nothing happened. Then everything happened. One servant collapsed hard enough to knock over his chair. Another grabbed the table as if the floor beneath him had suddenly tilted sideways. Someone began vomiting before they even reached the door. The room changed in seconds. Not slowly. Not gradually. Immediately. That detail terrified people later. Spoiled food spreads unevenly. One person gets sick first. Another hours later. Symptoms drift through a household like weather. This was different. This moved like a blade. Fast. precise, violent. 17 people became sick almost together. Some fell to the floor. Some could barely breathe. Others clawed at walls trying to stay standing. And somewhere inside that chaos came the realization that made everything worse. The bishop had not eaten. Bishop Fisher remained alive because, by pure chance, he never touched the meal. Some said he had already eaten earlier. Others claimed he was ill and had lost his appetite. A few believed he had been fasting. The truth almost stopped mattering. Because now another possibility entered the room. What if the poison was never meant for everyone? What if it was meant for one man? The kitchen became silent in a different way after that thought appeared. Even the servants understood what it could mean. Bishop Fisher was not an ordinary churchman. He was one of the most powerful religious voices in England. Worse than powerful, he was respected. Kings can survive enemies. What frightens them are respected enemies. Fisher had openly challenged King Henry VIII over his divorce from Catherine of Aragon. Not secretly, not behind closed doors. Publicly, he spoke carefully, but he spoke clearly. And in Henry's England, clarity could become dangerous very quickly. Now people inside the bishop's household were staring at poisoned bowls while servants carried bodies out of the room. The implications sat there with them. Heavy, unspoken. Someone may have tried to kill the bishop. And if that was true, this was no longer just a poisoning. It was politics. Which meant the danger had only started. By evening, 2 people were dead. One was a servant whose name barely survived in the records. The other was the poor woman who had arrived hungry at the gates earlier that day. She never made it home. That part disappeared quickly in official reports. History often remembers powerful men in detail and ordinary people in fragments. The woman became one more nameless victim swallowed by a larger event. But for the people who saw her collapse near the road, she was real. She had walked in hungry. Hours later, she was dead because she accepted food from the wrong kitchen on the wrong day. Richard Roose was seized before nightfall. Not politely. Not carefully. Servants dragged him away from the kitchen while others remained doubled over in pain around the room. Questions began immediately. Loud questions. Angry questions. And under pressure, the cook admitted something. Yes, he had added powder to the food. But then he said something strange. Something that made the entire story darker. He claimed he never meant to kill anyone. Stay with us till the end for valuable insights. Like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. Richard Roose kept repeating the same thing. It was not poison. That was his claim. Not medicine either. Not exactly. He described it as something meant to cause discomfort. Embarrassment. Illness for a few hours maybe. Nothing permanent. Nothing deadly. The explanation sounded weak the moment it left his mouth. 2 people were already dead. Others still lay shaking on the floors of Bishop Fisher's household. Some servants could not even stand without support. Whatever entered that pot had not behaved like a harmless joke. And yet Roose continued insisting he never intended murder. That statement created a second problem. If he was lying, then he was a killer. But if he was telling the truth, then somebody else had placed the real weapon in his hands. That possibility changed everything. Because kitchens do not create poison by accident. Somebody had to provide it. Somebody had to know what it was. Somebody had to understand where it would end up. And somewhere behind all of that stood a question nobody wanted to ask too loudly. Who truly wanted Bishop Fisher dead? To understand why fear spread so quickly after the poisoning, you have to understand the kind of man Fisher was in 1531. He was old by the standards of the time. 71 years old. Thin. Careful. Sharp-eyed. The sort of man who measured words before speaking them. Not because he was timid. Because he understood consequences. He had spent decades inside the English church and had survived long enough to watch kings change faces while power itself remained the same underneath. That gave him something dangerous. Perspective. Most men around King Henry VIII adjusted themselves to survive. They softened opinions. They learned when to stay quiet. They bent carefully with the direction of the court. Fisher did not. That was the problem. Henry VIII was already deep into the greatest personal and political crisis of his reign. He wanted his marriage to Catherine of Aragon ended. He wanted freedom to marry Anne Boleyn. He wanted the church to approve it cleanly and quickly. The church refused. Not completely. Not openly at first. But enough to slow him down. And every delay increased Henry's anger. Europe watched the situation carefully because Catherine was not simply a queen. She was connected to powerful royal bloodlines across the continent. Attacking her marriage meant creating enemies far beyond England. Inside that storm stood Bishop Fisher, publicly opposing the king. Not through whispers. Not through rumors. Openly. He defended Catherine's marriage in speeches, writings, and religious arguments that spread far outside England. Scholars respected him. Clergymen listened to him. Even people who disagreed with him admitted he was difficult to defeat in debate. That made him more dangerous than louder men. Noise can be ignored. Credibility cannot. Henry's advisors understood this perfectly. Men like Thomas Cromwell had already begun reshaping England piece by piece around the king's desires. Slowly, carefully, removing obstacles one at a time. But Fisher remained standing. Still speaking. Still refusing silence. Which meant by 1531, powerful people had reasons to want him gone. That does not prove they poisoned the food. But it explains why suspicion appeared so quickly after the deaths. Inside the king's court, survival depended on reading unspoken signals. Sometimes Henry did not need to order anything directly. People around him often understood what outcomes would please the crown. That kind of atmosphere creates dangerous men. Men who act before commands are spoken. The investigation into the poisoning moved fast in public but strangely slow underneath. Roose was questioned heavily. Records mention pressure, interrogation, repeated demands for answers. But something about the process feels incomplete. The questioning never truly expanded outward. No powerful names appeared. No larger conspiracy surfaced officially. The cook remained at the center of everything while the search for whoever supplied the powder seemed to stop almost before it began. That silence matters. Because silence inside political crises is rarely accidental. Some historians later argued that Roose simply acted alone. Others believed he was manipulated. A few suspected the poisoning may never have targeted Fisher at all. But none of those theories changed the atmosphere spreading through England. Fear had already entered the room. And fear behaves differently when kings become involved. News of the poisoning traveled quickly to Henry VIII. The king was nowhere near Rochester when it happened. He remained surrounded by the massive machinery of royal protection that followed him everywhere. Food tasters, guards, servants watched by other servants. Every meal prepared for Henry passed through layers of security because medieval kings understood something modern people sometimes forget. A blade can be stopped. Poison is harder. It moves invisibly. That terrified rulers throughout history more than open violence ever did. Armies announced themselves. Assassins risk capture. Poison hides inside trust itself. A cup. A plate. A spoon. That is all it needs. When Henry heard what happened in Bishop Fisher's household, he likely understood immediately why the story mattered beyond 2 deaths. A cook had done this. Not a soldier. Not a nobleman. Not a foreign spy. A cook. Someone whose entire profession depended on access. Someone who stood beside food every single day without attracting suspicion. For a king already surrounded by political enemies, that realization was deeply personal. Because if poison could reach a bishop's table once, then in theory it could reach the king's table too. And Henry VIII was not a man who reacted mildly to fear. Especially private fear. Especially fear he could not control. Within days, the atmosphere around court changed. The poisoning was no longer treated like an isolated crime. It became something larger. Something symbolic. The beginning of a nightmare the crown wanted crushed immediately and publicly. Not just punishment. A warning. And warnings from kings are rarely gentle. Henry VIII understood power. But more importantly, he understood vulnerability. That is what separated kings from ordinary men. Ordinary people feared losing their lives. Kings feared losing control. And in the 16th century, control often depended on something terrifyingly fragile. Trust. Trust in servants. Trust in food. Trust in the people standing closest to you. Poison destroys trust first. That is why rulers feared it so deeply. A sword attack is visible. You can prepare for it. Guards can stop it. Walls can slow it down. But poison slips through protection by disguising itself as routine. A meal. A drink. A familiar face entering the kitchen. That was enough. Henry's father, Henry VII, had spent years obsessed with security. By the end of his reign, suspicion surrounded nearly everything. Servants were watched constantly. Access to royal rooms became tightly controlled. Even loyalty itself felt temporary. Henry VIII hated appearing afraid the way his father had. But that did not mean the fear disappeared. It only changed shape. When news arrived from Rochester, the king likely realized something uncomfortable immediately. If a bishop's household could be infiltrated through the kitchen, then royal households were vulnerable too. And vulnerability frightened Henry more than opposition ever did. Especially now. Because England in 1531 was already unstable beneath the surface. Henry's marriage crisis had divided the country slowly into invisible sides. Noble families whispered carefully. Church leaders measured every public statement. Political alliances shifted quietly from room to room like shadows moving through corridors. Nobody fully trusted where events were heading anymore. And in the middle of that tension came a poisoning. Not somewhere distant. Not among criminals. Inside the household of one of England's most famous religious figures. That made the incident impossible to ignore. Still, what happened next surprised even people at court. Henry did not demand a normal investigation. He did not quietly arrest suspects and wait for evidence. Instead, he turned toward Parliament. Fast. Almost urgently. That detail matters because governments usually move slowly. Laws take time. Arguments. Delays. Negotiation. But after the poisoning at Fisher's household, the machinery of England suddenly accelerated. Like fear itself had entered government. Meetings began quickly. Discussions spread through court circles. And somewhere inside those conversations, a decision formed. The punishment would not simply fit the crime. The punishment would become a spectacle. Not because Roose alone frightened them. Because the idea behind him frightened them. A poisoned kingdom is difficult to govern. Once people begin suspecting food, every household changes. Every servant becomes questionable. Every meal creates hesitation. Fear moves into ordinary life and stays there. Henry wanted to stop that fear before it spread further. So the crown decided to make an example so terrible that nobody would ever forget it. Parliament responded with shocking speed. Within weeks, English law itself began changing around the poisoning case. That was unusual. Very unusual. Because murder laws already existed. Courts already handled violent crimes. Executions already happened regularly in Tudor England. Hanging, burning, beheading. Public punishment was nothing new. But this time the government acted as though ordinary law was insufficient. Poisoning would become something separate. Something worse. The legal language itself changed. Poisoning was treated not merely as murder, but as a unique threat against the order of society itself. Almost like an attack on trust, not just on bodies. And then came the most disturbing part. The new law did not wait for future crimes. It reached backward, toward Richard Roose. Retroactively. That word sounds technical now. Dry. Legal. But in 1531 it represented something deeply unsettling. English law traditionally followed a basic principle. People could only be punished according to laws that already existed when the act was committed. That principle protected everyone. At least in theory. The government had now decided to break it. Parliament named Richard Roose directly inside the law itself. Not after a trial. Not after years of evidence. First the law was written. Then the law declared what Roose had already done. That difference changed everything. Because a trial asks whether a man is guilty. This process assumed guilt first and built law around it afterward. It transformed Parliament from lawmakers into something closer to judges. Or executioners. The speed alone frightened people. Weeks earlier, poisoning had been treated under normal criminal law. Now suddenly England possessed an entirely new category of crime designed around one event and one terrified king. That is how fear reshapes governments. Quietly at first. Then all at once. And fear was spreading far beyond court walls now. Inside noble households, servants noticed changes immediately. Kitchen workers found themselves watched more closely. Questions appeared where trust once existed. Who prepared the meal? Who touched the bowl? Who entered the pantry? Invisible pressure settled over domestic life. Because Henry's response carried a message much larger than Richard Roose himself. The crown wanted everyone to understand something. No room was private anymore. Not even kitchens. Especially kitchens. The punishment chosen for Roose reflected that message perfectly. It was not designed simply to kill him. It was designed to horrify England permanently. Boiling alive. Even by Tudor standards, the sentence felt monstrous. Executions during this period were brutal already, but boiling introduced something psychologically different. It was slow, public, impossible to misunderstand. The method itself became part of the warning. And warnings become more powerful when people imagine themselves inside them. Word spread through London long before the execution day arrived. Crowds discussed it in markets and taverns. Some refused to believe the sentence was real. Others insisted the king had gone mad with fear. But the preparations continued. Chains were constructed. Iron frames assembled. A massive cauldron prepared specifically for the event. That detail stayed with witnesses later. The equipment had to be built for this. England had never done it before, which meant someone at some point sat down calmly and designed the mechanics of boiling a human being alive in public. That realization disturbed people almost as much as the crime itself, because it suggested something cold beneath the panic. Planning. Careful planning. And while all this happened, one question remained strangely unanswered. Where did the powder come from? Roose claimed someone gave it to him. But the deeper investigation never truly arrived. The cook stayed at the center. The larger shadow behind him remained untouched. Smithfield was already crowded before sunrise. People came early whenever executions were scheduled. Some arrived out of curiosity. Others came because public death had become part of life in Tudor England. A hanging could draw crowds the same way markets did. But this crowd felt different. Quieter. Uneasy. because rumors had spread for days about what was waiting at Smithfield. And rumors rarely prepare people for reality. The first thing many saw was the steam. White clouds rising into the cold morning air long before the crowd reached the center of the square. Then the smell of burning wood. Then finally the structure itself. The cauldron. Huge. Iron. Suspended above an enormous fire already roaring beneath it. People slowed when they saw it. Some stopped walking completely. Executions were familiar to London crowds. Beheadings happened. Hangings happened. Burnings happened. People understood those deaths. They knew how long they took. They knew when to look away. This was different. Nobody standing there had ever seen England do this before. That matters. Fear becomes stronger when people have no memory for comparison. The officials moved carefully around the platform, making final preparations while the crowd whispered to itself in waves. Those nearest to the front understood first. Then the realization spread backward through the mass of people. He was going into the water alive. You can almost feel the mood changing in the surviving accounts. Not loudly, not dramatically, just slowly. The kind of silence that grows when human beings realize something is about to happen that cannot be undone. Richard Roose was brought out under guard shortly afterward. There are very few detailed descriptions of his appearance that morning. History often preserves kings in perfect detail while leaving ordinary men blurred around the edges. But witnesses agreed on one thing. He looked terrified. Of course he did. Whatever role he actually played in the poisoning, whatever he truly knew or did not know, he understood now what awaited him. And there is something horrifying about the gap between crime and punishment here. 2 people had died. That was terrible. But now the state itself was preparing to torture a man publicly using machinery designed specifically for prolonged suffering. Fear had changed shape. The crowd watched as chains were secured above the cauldron. The water below rolled violently from heat. Steam covered parts of the platform in shifting clouds. Then came the final realization. This was not simply an execution. It was theater. Carefully designed theater. Everything about the scene communicated a message from the crown. The size of the crowd. The location. The slowness. The visibility of the cauldron itself. Henry VIII was not merely killing Richard Roose. He was teaching England a lesson. Do not poison food. Do not even think about it. Because whatever horror you imagine for others, the crown can return something worse. Public punishment has always worked this way. Governments rarely execute people only to remove them. They execute them to shape behavior in everyone watching. And this execution was designed to be unforgettable. Witnesses later described the sounds more than the visuals. The screaming. The crowd shifting backward. Some unable to keep watching. Others unable to stop. Because once it began, there was no quick ending. That was the point. A sword can fail once and succeed the second time. Hanging can end within moments. Even burning sometimes kills through smoke before flames fully consume the body. Boiling leaves no mercy. The water itself becomes the weapon. And the human mind understands heat instinctively. Everyone watching could imagine exactly what Roose felt. That made the horror personal in a way other executions were not. Some people prayed. Others turned away completely. And somewhere above all of it hung the terrifying realization that Parliament had created this punishment only weeks earlier. Which meant this suffering had been invented recently. Designed recently. Approved recently. The execution lasted long enough for the message to settle deep into public memory. That mattered more than Roose himself by that stage. Whether he acted alone no longer mattered. Whether he intended murder no longer mattered. The crown had transformed him into a symbol. And symbols do not receive mercy. By evening, London was carrying the story everywhere. Taverns repeated details. Markets argued over them. Households whispered about the cauldron during meals. Especially during meals. That was the true achievement of the execution. It entered kitchens. Servants who prepared food now worked under a new shadow. Every spice added to a dish. Every cup delivered to a table. Every unfamiliar ingredient suddenly carried risk. Not only risk of poisoning, risk of accusation. Because once fear becomes law, innocence itself starts behaving differently. Cooks became more careful about being watched. Employers began paying closer attention to preparation. Trust weakened quietly inside homes all across England. The poisoning at Bishop Fisher's household had spread far beyond 17 victims now. It had entered daily life. And Henry VIII considered that success. But there was another detail hidden beneath all the noise surrounding the execution. A detail almost nobody noticed at the time. The investigation had effectively ended. That should seem strange. A cook confessed to adding powder into food, yes. But where did the powder originate? Who supplied it? Who understood what it truly was? Those questions remained unanswered. Or perhaps worse, unasked. Officially, the Crown appeared satisfied. Roose had confessed. Parliament had acted. Punishment had been delivered publicly and brutally. England had witnessed the consequences. Case closed. Too neatly. Because real conspiracies rarely end so cleanly. And somewhere behind the screaming crowds, behind the steam rising over Smithfield, behind the king's public terror of poison, one possibility still remained alive. Richard Roose may never have been the most important person in the story. The law remained. That is the part people often forget. Executions end. Crowds go home. Fires burn out. But laws stay behind like shadows inside a country long after the original fear disappears. And Henry VIII's new poisoning law did exactly that. It settled over England quietly. Heavy. Permanent. At least for a while. The message from Smithfield spread faster than any official announcement ever could. People carried it from London into villages, estates, churches, kitchens, inns. Travelers repeated details beside fires at night. Merchants spoke about it while unpacking goods. Servants whispered about the boiling cauldron while preparing meals. The kingdom had seen many executions before, but this one lingered differently. Because everyone eats. That is what made the terror universal. Not everyone fears battlefields. Not everyone fears political arrest. But every human being eventually sits before food prepared by another person. Which meant the king's warning reached every level of society. Noble households changed first. We know this from scattered records that survive from the months following the execution. Servants dismissed unexpectedly. Kitchen staff replaced without clear explanation. Employers suddenly becoming suspicious of people they had trusted for years. The records rarely describe the emotion directly. History often hides emotions beneath polite language. But the pattern remains visible. Fear. Fear moving room to room through England. Because once poisoning becomes the center of national attention, ordinary behavior starts looking dangerous. A delayed illness after supper suddenly feels suspicious. A bitter taste in wine becomes alarming. A servant lingering too long near a tray begins attracting attention. Paranoia thrives inside uncertainty. And Henry's law created uncertainty everywhere. The punishment itself also changed relationships inside kitchens permanently. Before 1531, cooks occupied strange positions within wealthy households. They were servants, yes, but trusted servants. Important servants. A household could not function without them. Now that trust carried tension. Because every employer had witnessed what happened to Richard Roose. And every cook had witnessed it too. Imagine preparing meals after Smithfield. Imagine standing over boiling water every day while remembering exactly what the state had done to a man in your profession. Not for rebellion. Not for treason. For food. That psychological pressure mattered more than the law itself. The crown had effectively transformed kitchens into political spaces. Suddenly food preparation carried implications far beyond hunger. Every meal now existed inside the shadow of government fear. And fear changes behavior even when no crime occurs. Some cooks became almost performative in their transparency. Ingredients shown openly. Meals prepared visibly. Motions exaggerated carefully so employers could see nothing suspicious was happening. Innocence became something people acted out publicly. That is one of the strangest effects fear can have on a society. It teaches people not only to avoid guilt, but to constantly demonstrate innocence. Meanwhile, Bishop Fisher remained alive. That fact became stranger as time passed. The intended victim, assuming he truly was the target, had survived entirely through chance. Illness, timing, appetite. Whatever reason kept him from eating that day also kept him breathing. But surviving did not make him safe. Quite the opposite. Because Fisher continued opposing Henry VIII even after the poisoning. That detail matters enormously. A lesser man might have withdrawn after something like this. He might have softened his public positions, spoken more carefully, avoided direct confrontation with the crown. Fisher did none of that. He remained exactly what he had always been. A problem. By the early 1530s, Henry's break from the Catholic Church was accelerating rapidly. Laws shifted. Religious authority changed shape. Men who once seemed untouchable suddenly found themselves vulnerable. And Bishop Fisher still refused silence. He rejected Henry's growing claim to supreme authority over the English Church. Publicly, openly, again. That decision slowly pushed him toward disaster. The irony is impossible to ignore. In 1531, the Crown reacted to an attempted poisoning of Fisher with extraordinary force. Parliament rewrote law around the incident. The state presented itself almost as the bishop's protector. But power changes quickly around frightened kings. By 1534, Fisher was arrested. Not poisoned. Not secretly removed. Officially arrested. He was imprisoned in the Tower of London for refusing to accept Henry as supreme head of the Church of England. The same man whose survival once triggered national panic now stood accused by the very government that claimed to defend him. That contradiction reveals something important about power. Governments rarely protect people. They protect priorities. And priorities change. Fisher remained imprisoned for more than a year. Old. Thin. Weakening physically inside the tower. Yet even there he refused surrender. Refused compromise. Refused language designed merely to survive. That stubbornness eventually sealed his fate. In June 1535, Bishop John Fisher was executed. Beheaded on Tower Hill. 76 years old. The same king whose fear of poison had supposedly inspired brutal new laws now signed the death warrant of the man those laws were supposedly protecting. Same crown. Same government. Same parliament. Only the political needs had changed. Think about how terrifying that must have felt to people watching events unfold. A bishop survives an apparent assassination attempt. The state reacts with overwhelming violence. A cook is boiled alive publicly as punishment. Then only 4 years later, the bishop himself is legally executed by that same state. What conclusion could ordinary people possibly draw from that sequence? Perhaps this. Protection from power is temporary. Fear lasts longer. And somewhere beneath all these public events, the poisoning, the law, the execution, the bishop's death, one unresolved mystery still remained untouched. The powder. No surviving document clearly identifies what substance entered the pot that day. That absence is deeply strange. Tudor records could describe poisons when necessary. Arsenic, mercury compounds, toxic plants. The vocabulary existed. Courts cared about such details. Yet in this case, the substance itself stays blurred. Mentioned, never truly explained. Which raises another uncomfortable possibility. Maybe people higher up did not want certain questions answered publicly, because identifying the poison might have revealed something larger. A supplier, a connection, a path leading beyond Richard Roose toward people far more dangerous to accuse. And if that is true, then the execution at Smithfield begins looking different. Less like justice, more like containment. History preserves strange things. Kings survive in perfect detail. Their signatures, their clothes, their meals, their arguments. Sometimes historians even know what they complained about during breakfast. But ordinary people disappear constantly. A servant dies and becomes one sentence. A woman collapses beside a road and loses her name entirely. A cook screams inside boiling water and survives only as a warning. That is how records work. Not because history is always dishonest. Because power decides what deserves remembering. And the story of Richard Roose contains one silence larger than all the others. The powder. The closer you examine this case, the stranger that silence becomes. The records describe effects clearly enough. Sudden illness. Violent reactions. Multiple victims collapsing almost together. Death arriving quickly for two people. But the substance itself remains vague. Almost hidden. That matters because Tudor England was not ignorant about poison. Courts understood toxic substances existed. Physicians understood symptoms. Chroniclers often named poisons when they were known. Yet here, during one of the most famous poisoning cases of Henry VIII's reign, the official record becomes strangely foggy at the exact moment it should become precise. Why? Maybe the answer is simple. Maybe nobody truly knew what the powder was. But there is another possibility. A darker one. Maybe the investigation stopped exactly where powerful people wanted it to stop. Richard Roose admitted placing powder into the food. That much survived. But after that, the path goes cold. No larger network officially appeared. No supplier publicly identified. No political enemy charged. The cook absorbed the entire story into himself. Conveniently. Too conveniently. Because think carefully about the situation. A household cook suddenly decides on his own to poison one of the most politically controversial bishops in England during one of the most unstable periods of Henry VIII's reign? Possible. But dangerous men inside dangerous political systems rarely work alone. And Roose's own defense keeps returning like a shadow through the records. He claimed he believed the substance was harmless. That statement changes the shape of the entire event. Because if he lied, then he knowingly murdered innocent people. But if he told the truth, then somewhere before the poisoning another conversation happened. A private conversation. A hidden room. Someone handed him powder. Someone explained what it supposedly was. Someone convinced him to place it into food. That person vanished completely from history. No name. No arrest. No confession. Nothing. And perhaps that silence tells us more than the surviving records themselves. Governments are excellent at documenting the people they punish. Trials create paperwork. Executions create witnesses. Laws create archives. But conspiracies connected to power often leave only absences behind. A missing letter. An unfinished testimony. A question nobody officially asks. The Richard Roose case feels full of those absences. Especially because the political atmosphere surrounding Bishop Fisher already carried enormous tension. powerful factions at court wanted him weakened or removed. Henry's marriage crisis was transforming England from the inside. Religious authority itself was breaking apart. In moments like that, dangerous solutions become imaginable. Not always ordered directly, sometimes merely understood. That is how political fear operates in royal courts. A king does not always need to say what he wants aloud. Ambitious men learn to predict desires before commands arrive. And once that culture exists, responsibility becomes difficult to trace. Who truly caused an event? The man who acted? The man who suggested? The man who created the atmosphere where such acts became useful? History rarely answers those questions cleanly. Instead, it leaves fragments. A poisoned pot. 2 dead victims. A bishop who survives by chance. A terrified king rewriting law. A cook boiled alive in public. And somewhere behind all of it, an invisible hand holding powder no document ever fully explains. The poisoning law itself survived 16 years before finally disappearing in 1547 after Henry VIII's death. Quietly removed. Quietly abandoned. Not because it failed. Because even Tudor England eventually became uncomfortable with what it represented. Retroactive punishment. Extreme public torture. A legal system reshaped by fear instead of principle. The boiling cauldrons disappeared. But the atmosphere they created did not vanish so easily. Fear never truly disappears once governments teach people to expect it. And perhaps that is the most important part of this entire story. Not the poison. Not even the execution. The fear. Because Henry VIII wanted England terrified of poisoners. Instead, he created a country where servants feared accusation, employers feared meals, and ordinary kitchens became places of quiet suspicion. Fear escaped the law that created it. It spread further than intended. That always happens eventually. And then there is Bishop Fisher himself. The old man at the center of everything. He survived the poisoning only to die later at the hands of the same crown that once claimed outrage on his behalf. The same government that rewrote law after someone tried to kill him eventually decided killing him was politically useful after all. There is something deeply cold about that sequence. In 1531, the state treated Fisher's survival almost like a national emergency. By 1535, his execution became state policy. That transformation reveals how unstable protection really is when power changes direction. Kings fear threats until those threats become convenient. Then fear becomes justification. And somewhere inside all these events sits one final image historians can never fully erase. A room. Not a courtroom. Not Parliament. Not Smithfield. A smaller room. Private. Unrecorded. At some point before 17 people ate from that pot, someone stood beside Richard Roose and handed him powder. Maybe the conversation lasted seconds. Maybe longer. Maybe promises were made. Maybe lies were told. Maybe Roose truly believed no one would die. Or maybe he understood everything from the beginning. We cannot know. Because history never opened that door completely. It stopped at the cook. Stopped deliberately, perhaps. And that is what makes this story linger centuries later. Not the screams from Smithfield. Not the king's laws. Not even the deaths themselves. It is the feeling that somewhere behind the official story stands another version hidden just out of sight. A version carried to the grave by people powerful enough never to appear in the records. The documents survived. The law survived. The execution survived. But the truth inside that room never did. If you enjoy dark, untold history, subscribe because we uncover what others won't.